Okay, welcome to Seven Continents, One Story, and I genuinely cannot wait for this one.
Glad to have you with us today. This is going to be a good one.
I've been looking forward to this all week, honestly.
I'm Ethan, 13 Maltese, and way too obsessed with history for someone my age.
I'm Nils, professor of history, originally from Sweden.
And I'm Celine, joining you from Edinburgh, Scotland. I read far too many history books in my spare time.
Every episode, we go deep into a story from one of the seven continents. Ancient stuff, modern stuff, stories that actually change the world.
Stories that deserve to be told properly, not just as a footnote in a textbook.
Because history is full of moments that still echo today if you know where to look.
History just hits different when you know the full story. See you next time.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Seven Continents, One Story. I'm Celine.
I'm Nils, and honestly, I've been looking forward to today's episode all week.
And I'm Ethan. Today's topic is going to blow your minds, I can already tell.
That's the energy I love to hear. What's got you so excited, Ethan?
Well, we're talking about a place that should be completely frozen, completely dead, and lifeless, and yet 280 million years ago, it was covered in lush forests.
Antarctica with forests.
Not just forests, Nils. The most beautifully preserved forest we've ever discovered. And the story of how scientists found it? Well, let's just say it rivals any adventure tale. Right, so Nils, I'm going to make a challenge. I've got 10 euros that says you cannot guess what we're discussing today, based on 3 clues I'm about to give you.
Oh, Celine, you know I cannot resist a wager. But when I win, you're buying our coffee for a month.
Wait, coffee? What happened to, actual steaks?
Ethan, for Nils, free coffee is the ultimate prize. He's Swedish. Coffee runs in his veins.
I will not apologize for having excellent taste in Nordic beverages. Now, Celine, I'm ready for your clues.
Clue number 1. These objects are made of wood. Actual wood, and they're 280 million years old.
That's not a clue, that's just saying really old trees, come on.
Patience, young historian. Clue 2. They were buried by volcanic ash and preserved so perfectly that scientists found actual proteins inside them. Proteins that haven't degraded in nearly 300 million years.
Wait. Celine, where are we talking about?
Antarctica.
Oh my goodness. I actually came across one of these fragments when I was researching in Milwaukee. I remember looking at images of it and thinking, this shouldn't exist. This is impossible, and yet here it is.
Okay, I'm totally lost. Can someone explain what we're talking about?
Trees in Antarctica?
Yeah, I got that part, but how? Antarctica is frozen. There's no trees, there's nothing but ice and penguins.
That's exactly why this discovery is so extraordinary. But before we dive into the science, I need to paint a picture for you, a picture of a world that no longer exists. I have something here in my collection, a museum-quality replica of one of the most important paleobotanical finds of the 21st century. It's approximately the size of my hand. The exterior is gray, weathered by time. But if you could look inside it, if you could slice a thin section and examine it under a microscope, you would see something that defies explanation.
What would you see?
You would see cell walls, perfect, intact cell walls from the xylem of an ancient tree. You would see the exact structure of wood tissue that lived 280 million years ago. And most remarkably, you would see traces of amino acids, proteins, organic molecules that should have disintegrated eons ago. These trees were mummified by volcanic ash. Their death became their preservation.
That's why you looked so shocked when I mentioned Antarctica, isn't it?
Because it means we have a window into a world we thought was gone forever. It means we can understand how life survived in the most extreme environments on Earth. Let me take you there. The year is 280 million years ago. You're not on the frozen continent we know today. You're standing in the Transantarctic Mountains. The sky above is a pale blue, and in the summer months, the sun will not set for nearly 4 months straight. Imagine that. Imagine constant daylight.
That sounds kind of beautiful, but also terrifying.
It is both. The temperature is temperate, perhaps 15 to 20 degrees Celsius on a warm day. Not tropical, but not frozen either. You smell rich soil. The vegetation around you is dense, but not like modern forests. These are not oaks or pines. These are Glossopteris, seed ferns, the dominant plants of this ancient world.
And you said the sun doesn't set for 4 months?
Exactly, Celine. Which means in winter, there's darkness for 3, sometimes 4 months straight. Picture yourself as one of these trees. You're growing in constant sunlight, storing energy like mad, building your wood tissue as quickly as possible. And then, darkness. Complete darkness for months. You slow your metabolism. You retreat inward. You survive in a kind of botanical hibernation.
So these weren't like tough, hardy trees. They were doing something we didn't even know was possible.
Precisely, Ethan. They had adaptations, physiological tricks that allowed them to thrive in a regime of extreme light and darkness that would kill most modern plants. And then, something changed everything. Right, let's set the broader scene. 280 million years ago, we're in the late Permian period. The continents on Earth were arranged very differently than they are today. All the landmasses had collided into one supercontinent called Pangaea, and the southern portion, where our trees are growing, was called Gondwana.
Gondwana. I've read about this. That's the ancient continent that included Africa, South America, Australia, India, and Antarctica.
Yes, exactly. You've been reading in that library of yours, haven't you?
Every spare moment I get. The concept that all these continents were once connected, it's mind-blowing.
But wait, how does that make sense? India is tropical, Africa is tropical, and savanna. How would they all be connected and also have temperate forests?
That's a brilliant question, Ethan, and it gets at the heart of why this period is so unusual. The entire planet was warmer. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were much, much higher than they are today. We're talking possibly 2 to 3 times higher.
So it was like a greenhouse effect. All that CO2 was trapping heat.
Exactly. The Earth was warmer from pole to pole. Antarctica, even at the South Pole, was habitable. It was no paradise. The polar night was still unbearably long, but it was livable. Life found a way. And these trees, these Glossopteris, they dominated. Vast forests stretched across the southern continents.
So like, if I'm standing in Antarctica, in the Permian, what do I see? Is it like rainforest? Is it sparse?
The forests were not dense tropical jungles. Imagine something closer to boreal forests, the pine forests you find in modern northern Canada or Scandinavia. Trees spaced with some gaps between them. Lower growing vegetation on the forest floor, but alive, thriving. And then in winter, when the darkness came, most of the trees dropped their leaves. They went dormant, like trees do today when it gets cold.
That's a form of hibernation, isn't it? Deciduousness as a survival strategy?
Yes, you've got it. The trees weren't evergreen. They couldn't afford to maintain leaves during a 4-month darkness with no photosynthesis possible. Now, this discovery, these beautiful preserved fossils, they wouldn't have been found and properly studied without one person's determination and scientific vision. His name is Eric Goldbranson. He's a paleoecologist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
A paleoecologist? That's the study of ancient ecosystems, right?
Precisely. Goldbranson spent years studying how plants responded to environmental stresses, how they adapted, how they survived. But he didn't just want to study fossils in museums. He wanted to find them in the field, at the actual boundary where these ancient forests collapsed.
So he went to Antarctica, just like that?
He planned an expedition. He gathered funding from the National Science Foundation. He assembled a team, and in November 2016, he arrived at McMurdo Station, the hub for American Antarctic research. What he and his team were looking for would challenge everything we thought we knew about polar ecosystems.
But they found it, obviously.
They did, but let me tell you about how.
Hold on, before we get to the discovery, I need to understand something. You said atmospheric CO2 was 2 or 3 times higher. What caused that? Was it like volcanoes?
Brilliant thinking, Ethan. Yes, partly. Massive volcanic activity was pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. But also, remember, this is 300 million years ago. The world's ecosystems were very different. There were fewer plants consuming CO2. There were huge swamps and coal forests that were decomposing and releasing carbon.
And there was no coal industry yet, no humans burning fossil fuels. This was all natural processes.
Entirely natural. The planet was regulating itself, but in a way that created this warm, humid world.
But that's kind of like what's happening now, right? We're raising CO2 levels and the planet is getting warmer.
That's the uncomfortable parallel, yes. The Permian period was a world of high CO2 and global warmth, and as we'll discuss later, what happened at the end of that period was catastrophic. This is why scientists study the Permian so carefully now, because in some ways, we're recreating conditions that haven't existed for nearly 300 million years.
And we don't know how it will turn out for us, like they didn't know for their forests.
Exactly. Now, about that replica in my collection, let me tell you more about what makes it extraordinary. In December 2016, Gulbranson's team established a field camp at the McIntyre Promontory in the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. They were looking for specific geological layers, strata that dated to the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic period.
Is that boundary important?
Celine, it's one of the most important boundaries in the entire geological record. The Permian-Triassic boundary marks the greatest mass extinction event in Earth's history. We call it the Great Dying.
The greatest mass extinction? What about the dinosaurs?
The dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid impact 66 million years ago. Devastating, yes, but the Permian extinction was worse. We're talking about 90% of marine species vanishing, 70% of terrestrial species disappearing. The world came closer to becoming a lifeless planet at the Permian-Triassic boundary than at any other time in its history.
And Gulbranson's team was looking for evidence of this event in the fossils?
They were looking for the moment it happened, the moment the world changed. And what they found was these perfectly preserved tree specimens, frozen in time, preserved by volcanic ash. The ash that buried them came from massive volcanic eruptions, the Siberian traps, some of the largest volcanic events the planet has ever seen.
So the trees are like a time capsule? They show us what the world was like right before everything went wrong?
Yes, exactly. They are a snapshot of an ancient world in crisis, a world that didn't know it was about to face the greatest challenge life had ever encountered. Let me take you to the McIntyre Promontory in late December 2016. Imagine it. You're at the edge of the world, literally. The Trans-Antarctic Mountains tower around you, some of the tallest peaks on the continent. The temperature is dropping. It's December, which means it's summer in Antarctica, but summer here means -20 to -30 Celsius. Wind is constant, 30, 40, sometimes 70 miles per hour, gusting across the glacier.
That sounds completely miserable.
How do you even work in those conditions? What would the team be doing?
They're climbing through the exposed rock face, looking for the Buckley Formation, a geological layer rich with coal and fossils. This is not easy work. The rock is harsh. The conditions are unforgiving. Frostbite is a constant danger, but Gulbranson and his team push forward because they know what they're looking for.
But how do they even know where to look? Antarctica is huge. The Trans-Antarctic Mountains go on for thousands of miles.
That's where Gulbranson's preparation comes in. He'd studied previous expeditions. He'd read accounts from geologists who'd been to this region before. He knew from the geological literature that the Buckley Formation would be exposed in certain places. And when he stood on the glacier and looked at the landscape, he could read the rocks like a story. He could identify the right layers, the right age, the right environment.
That's the skill of a real geologist, isn't it? Years of experience, reading the landscape.
Precisely. Which is why, despite the brutal conditions and the vastness of Antarctica, the team knew approximately where to search.
So did they find them right away, or?
Late December. Cold. Exhausted. And then one of the team members spots something. Gray sedimentary rock cutting through the snow. Not ice. Rock. And when Gulbranson looks at it, he knows immediately what it is. The Buckley Formation. They've found the right layer. I've read accounts of this moment from the team. They began excavating carefully. They could see fossils in the rock, not complete trees. These are fragments, preserved wood pieces. But as they worked, as they carefully extracted each specimen, they began to understand what they were looking at.
What were they looking at exactly?
13 fossilized tree fragments, each one showing the internal structure of ancient wood in remarkable detail. Most of them belong to the genus Glossopteris, those seed ferns I mentioned. But what made these fragments extraordinary wasn't just their age, it was the preservation.
What do you mean the preservation? They're fossils, right? So that they're turned to stone?
Yes, they're permineralized, Minerals filled in the pore spaces. But the remarkable thing is that the original organic material was still there. In the thin sections they later examined under microscopes, scientists could see structures so fine that they were almost at the cellular level. And even more incredibly, chemical analysis showed traces of amino acids, proteins, biomolecules that shouldn't exist after 280 million years.
How is that even possible?
The volcanic ash acted like a hermetic seal. It buried these trees so quickly, within weeks rather than months or years, that the process of decomposition was arrested. The oxygen was cut off. The conditions were perfect for preserving not just the structure of the wood, but the chemical signature of the living tissue itself.
That's like finding ancient DNA, isn't it?
In a way, yes. It's not DNA that degrades too quickly, but it's as close as we can get. These trees are essentially mummified. They're a time capsule, not just of what the Permian forests looked like, but of what they were chemically, physiologically, at the moment of burial.
And I imagine this has changed how scientists think about polar ecosystems.
It has revolutionized it. Before this discovery, we had theories about how plants could survive polar conditions. We had some fossil evidence, but we didn't have this level of cellular detail. We didn't have proof that trees could grow 20, 30, 40 meters tall in an environment of extreme light and darkness. Gulbranson and his team proved it was not just possible, but thriving.
But wait, you made it sound like Gulbranson did all the work. Was it just him?
No, there was a team, but Gulbranson was the driving force. He was the one with the vision for what to look for and why it mattered. He's a geochemist as well as a paleoecologist. His specific expertise was in understanding how plants respond to rapid environmental change, how their chemistry changes when they're stressed.
So he wasn't just looking for any fossils. He was looking for fossils that could tell a story about stress and adaptation.
Exactly. Gulbranson wanted to understand the moment these forests died. He wanted to know what the plants were experiencing chemically when the Siberian Traps eruptions began, when volcanic gases flooded the atmosphere, when the climate began to collapse. And these trees, preserved so perfectly, they could tell him. They could show him what stress looks like in ancient wood.
How can you tell if a tree was stressed by looking at its wood?
Tree rings tell the story. You can see when growth was rapid, wide rings, and when growth was slow, narrow rings. But you can also see other markers, changes in wood density, signs of fungal infection, evidence of the tree struggling to survive. Gulbranson could look at these specimens and see the last years of their lives. He could read their autobiography in the wood.
That's heartbreaking, actually. These trees that survived for decades in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and then they were buried and died.
Yes, and that's why finding them was so crucial, because their death was not just a local event. It was part of a global extinction, and understanding their story helps us understand the extinction itself. Now, I need to tell you something about Antarctic exploration and these discoveries. Fossils from Antarctica aren't new. In 1912, Robert Falcon Scott, yes, the famous explorer, his Antarctic expedition found Glossopteris fossils.
Scott found these? The explorer who died trying to reach the South Pole?
He did, and here's something that shows Scott's character. His team was struggling, starving, exhausted, knowing they might not survive. But when they found those Glossopteris specimens, Scott's men refused to leave them behind. They carried them, 35 pounds of fossils, at the cost of energy they desperately needed.
They knew those fossils were important enough to die for?
They did. Scott wrote in his journal that these fossils proved Antarctica had once been temperate, that life had thrived here. He died before getting back to base, but his team completed the journey and delivered the fossils to the Royal Geographic Society. Scott's last act of science was bringing those fossils home.
And now, 100 years later, Gulbranson's team is continuing that work.
Yes, Scott's fossils raised the question. Gulbranson's team answered it with unprecedented detail. These fragments from the McIntyre Promontory are far better preserved than anything Scott's expedition could have collected. But they're connected. They're part of the same story of human curiosity and scientific determination.
And now we're studying these fossils because of climate change, right? Because we want to understand what happens when the world gets too warm.
Precisely, Ethan. Scott was driven by exploration and scientific curiosity. We're driven by something more urgent. We're looking at the Permian as a warning, as a story that ended in catastrophe. Understanding those forests, Understanding how they lived and died might help us understand our own future.
I'm curious about the rock layers themselves. You mentioned the Buckley Formation. Can you explain what that is?
Of course, the Buckley Formation is a geological unit that spans from about 300 to 250 million years old. It's full of fossil plants and coal seams. Coal, remember, forms from ancient plant material, so the entire region is essentially a fossil graveyard of Permian forests.
So there are more fossils there? These 13 fragments Goldbrandson found, they're not the only ones?
There are many more. The Buckley Formation in the Transantarctic Mountains is one of the richest sources of Permian plant fossils in the world. But what made these particular 13 specimens special was their preservation quality and the layer they were found in. They were at a specific stratigraphic horizon, a particular point in geological time that appears to be right at the boundary between relative stability and rapid change.
So you could tell from the rocks above and below them what the conditions were?
Exactly. A good geologist can read the rocks like a text. The rocks below the fossils tell you what came before. The ash layer directly above them tells you what happened during their burial, and the rocks above that tell you what happened after. In this case, the ash layer is a volcanic ash from the Siberian traps, the same eruptions that would trigger the greatest extinction event in Earth's history.
So these trees were buried in volcanic ash from the biggest volcanic event ever?
In the biggest volcanic event the planet has ever experienced. These trees were buried by the opening act of a catastrophe that would reshape the entire biosphere. And because they were buried so quickly, they captured a moment in time. They show us what the world was like before everything changed. Once the team brought the specimens back to the laboratory, the real work began. Years of analysis, looking at thin sections under microscopes, running geochemical tests, trying to extract as much information as possible from every fragment.
What kinds of tests?
Radiometric dating to confirm the age, paleomagnetic analysis to determine the latitude where the trees grew, trace element analysis, isotope ratios to understand the climate and moisture levels, and most fascinating to me, preservation analysis, looking at the cellular structures to understand the original physiology of the trees.
That's a lot of tests.
Yes, and that's just the beginning. Scientists want to understand everything. How fast did these trees grow? What was their water use? Did they show signs of stress? What other organisms lived with them? Because every detail contributes to our understanding of how this ancient ecosystem functioned.
And what did the tests show?
They showed that these were sophisticated trees with complex strategies for surviving in polar conditions. First, they were deciduous, as we discussed. They shed leaves in winter to conserve energy. But the latest research suggests it might have been more complex than simple leaf drop. They might have had a kind of metabolic dormancy, almost like hibernation in animals.
Trees can hibernate.
In a sense, yes. The tree's metabolism slows dramatically during the dark months. Growth essentially stops. The tree enters a quiescent state where it's using minimal energy, waiting for the sun to return. When the spring comes, when the sun doesn't set again, the tree explodes with growth. It races to accumulate as much biomass as possible before darkness returns.
That's almost poetic. A tree's year is so extreme, either explosive growth or absolute dormancy.
It is. And what's remarkable is that Glossopteris apparently managed this for millions of years. It was a successful strategy, until suddenly it wasn't.
So what changed? Why did these forests disappear?
That's where the story gets dark. 252 million years ago, the Siberian traps began erupting. We're not talking about normal volcanism. We're talking about the largest volcanic event in the planet's recorded history. For perhaps 100,000 years, massive eruptions continued. Lava covered an area larger than the continental United States. And as the lava flowed, it released gases, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, all pouring into the atmosphere.
That would warm the planet.
It did, dramatically. Within a relatively short time, geologically speaking just a few thousand years, the global temperature rose several degrees. The oceans acidified. The climate became unstable and chaotic. And now, I want to ask you a question. I want to frame this as a choice point. Imagine you are one of these Glossopteris trees in Antarctica. You've survived for millions of years in this harsh environment. You've mastered the art of polar survival. And suddenly, conditions begin to change.
Okay, what's the choice?
The choice is this, and I know it sounds strange to think of a tree making a choice, but bear with me. Your environment is becoming warmer, yes, but it's also becoming more chaotic. The light-dark cycle is still the same, but the temperatures are no longer reliable. Do you spend energy adapting to new heat stress? Do you change your physiology to cope with new conditions? Do you maintain your hibernation cycle that worked so well before? Or do you simply try to survive as you always have?
I think I'd try to adapt. Evolution and natural selection usually favor flexibility.
But maybe the tree can't adapt fast enough. Maybe millions of years of evolution designed it perfectly for one thing, and now that thing is gone.
Both of you are right. That's the tragedy. The trees were perfectly adapted to the Permian world of high CO2, temperate climate, and extreme light cycles. But when the Siberian traps eruptions pushed the climate too far, too fast, those adaptations became liabilities instead of assets.
And the fossils show this? They show the trees struggling?
The evidence suggests the trees experienced rapid stress, and then, within a relatively short time, they died. They were buried by volcanic ash and lahars, mixtures of ash and rock from the volcanic activity. And that was the end of the Permian forests in Antarctica. For the next 50 million years, until the dinosaur age fully ended, Antarctic forests would not flourish like this again.
50 million years? That's longer than dinosaurs existed.
Much longer. The dinosaurs ruled for about 165 million years. The recovery from the Great Dying took longer than that in some ecosystems. This extinction wasn't like the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. Sudden, dramatic, a moment. This was a drawn-out catastrophe. The biosphere took a long time to collapse and even longer to recover.
Is that why this is relevant to us? Because we're changing the climate, but we don't know how fast it will collapse?
Precisely, Celine. We're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at rates that haven't been seen since the Permian extinction. We're conducting a planetary experiment. And Gobranson's fossils help us understand what happened the last time the climate changed this dramatically. The Permian extinction didn't destroy all life, but it destroyed most of it. It took the biosphere hundreds of thousands of years to recover, and that was without intelligent beings making decisions about what to do.
So it's kind of a warning.
Yes, a warning written in rock and fossilized wood. Now, remember that artifact I told you about at the beginning? That fragment in my collection? Let me give you the final clue that reveals what we've been discussing.
We're ready.
This piece of wood was examined by paleoecologists and geochemists. They found within it preserved proteins, fragments of the enzymes that powered photosynthesis 280 million years ago. They found fungal hyphae, thread-like structures from fungi that were decomposing the wood even as it was being buried. They found traces of the very moment of death, preserved in mineral and stone.
So the artifact is a Glossopteris tree fragment from the McIntyre Promontory?
Yes, it's a piece of wood from one of those 13 specimens discovered by Eric Gobranson's team in January 2017. When I hold the replica in my hands, I'm holding a piece of a tree that died 280 million years ago. I'm holding evidence of a world that's gone forever. I'm holding a bridge between the ancient past and our uncertain future.
And it's in a museum now for people to see?
The original specimens are carefully preserved and studied at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Museum-quality replicas are available to institutions around the world. And every time someone looks at these specimens, they're seeing a moment of geological history. They're seeing the answer to the question, how did the Permian forests grow at the South Pole?
So this discovery answered a question that scientists have been asking for over 100 years, since Scott's expedition?
It did, Ethan. It provided the detail, the cellular evidence, the chemical signatures that proved conclusively that not only did Glossopteris forests exist in Antarctica, but they were sophisticated, thriving ecosystems. They were not marginal or struggling. They were successful, until they weren't. Earlier, I mentioned Eric Goldbranson in passing. Let me tell you why his story is so important, why I call him an unsung hero of modern paleobotany.
What makes him unsung if the discovery was so important?
Because while the fossils are famous, the man behind them is not. Most people who've read about the fossil forest discovery know the facts: 28-million-year-old trees, Antarctic forests. But they don't know the person who had the vision to look for them, who planned the expedition, who spent weeks in brutal cold and analyzing rocks, who then spent years in the laboratory solving the mystery of how these trees lived.
But he got to publish the research, didn't he? He got the credit?
In academic circles, yes, But Gulbranson's story is one of a scientist driven not by fame but by curiosity. He didn't go to Antarctica to become famous. He went because he was obsessed with understanding how life survives in extreme environments. He went because he wanted to solve a puzzle. And when he found those fossils, he didn't trumpet it immediately. He spent months analyzing them, confirming the findings, gathering data.
That's true scientific integrity, isn't it?
It is. Eric Gulbranson represents the best of scientific inquiry. The patience, the rigor, the willingness to spend months in the field and years in the lab to get the right answer. This discovery didn't happen because someone was looking for fame. It happened because someone was deeply committed to understanding the ancient world.
So we should remember Eric Gulbranson's name.
We should. Remember Eric Gulbranson? Remember that great scientific discoveries come not from individual geniuses, but from dedicated researchers who commit their lives to asking hard questions and pursuing answers with integrity. Now that we understand the discovery, let me take you deeper into what the science tells us. The presence of amino acids in these fossils is almost unprecedented. Proteins generally degrade quickly. Amino acids should not survive millions of years, but the conditions of rapid burial and isolation allowed them to persist.
How did the volcanic ash actually preserve the proteins?
Volcanic ash is acidic. It's low in oxygen. These conditions slow chemical degradation. The minerals in the ash can also precipitate onto the proteins, essentially encasing them in a protective mineral shield. What would normally take days or weeks to decompose can be arrested. The tree becomes mummified, just as if it were preserved in a desert.
Is that the same way Egyptian mummies were preserved?
In a sense, yes. The principle is similar. Rapid burial, low oxygen, mineral-rich environment. The Egyptian mummies benefited from dry heat and desert conditions. These Antarctic trees benefited from volcanic ash and cold conditions. Different preservation mechanisms, but similar results, organic material persisting for millennia.
Are researchers still studying these specimens? Is there more to discover?
Absolutely. In fact, the story continues to develop. After the 2016-2017 expedition, the team has organized follow-up expeditions. They found additional fossils. They've been able to map the exact location of the Permian-Triassic boundary in Antarctica. We now know that the transition from the Permian to the Triassic, from flourishing forests to a stressed biosphere, happened in this region much like it did elsewhere on Earth.
So these trees are evidence of a global catastrophe?
They are a local snapshot of a global crisis. Wherever you look on Earth from that time, China, Russia, Australia, the Middle East, you see the same pattern. Permian forests, complex ecosystems, and then rapid collapse. These Antarctic trees aren't unique in their fate. They're unique in how well preserved they are, which allows us to understand their fate in unprecedented detail.
When you think about it, it's rather moving. These trees that survived for millions of years in one of Earth's harshest environments, and they were part of this global extinction event that they couldn't survive.
It is moving, Celine, and that emotion is important because it reminds us that extinction isn't abstract. It's the death of specific organisms, specific ecosystems, specific ways of life. And that's why these fossils matter. They make the Permian extinction real. They make it tangible. Now, you might be wondering, and this is a fair question, why does a Permian forest matter to us in 2026? We're not living in the Permian. We're living in the Anthropocene, the age of humans. But these fossils matter because they tell us something crucial about how the Earth responds to rapid climate change.
Go on.
The Permian Triassic extinction was caused by the same thing we're concerned about today, rapid increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide. The Siberian Traps eruptions pumped CO2 into the air. Today, burning coal, oil, and natural gas does the same thing. The scale is different. The Siberian Traps operated for 100,000 years. We've been industrializing for only 250 years. But we're changing the atmosphere in ways that are comparable.
So are we going to have another extinction event?
We might, Ethan. We're conducting a planetary-scale experiment with an outcome we can't fully predict. But here's the crucial difference. We have choices. The Glossopteris trees couldn't choose to emit less CO2 or reduce their environmental impact. They could only adapt or die. We have agency. We have the ability to change our course.
And these fossils show us what's at stake. They show us what happened when the climate changed too fast for ecosystems to adapt.
Exactly. The fossil forest discovery gives us a historical perspective. We're looking at a planet that faced a crisis. We're seeing what happens when the climate tips. And from a scientific standpoint, we're learning how to read those signs, how to understand the mechanism of extinction, so that we can try to prevent it from happening again.
Is that why scientists are so interested in this research? Because it's like a warning?
Yes, Eric Goldbranson and thousands of scientists around the world are studying paleoclimate because they understand that the past predicts the future. These 280-million-year-old trees are speaking to us from the deep past. They're telling us about a world in crisis. They're warning us, and we have the wisdom to listen. Let me share some of the remarkable details that make this story even more interesting than the big picture. First, when the team extracted the fossils, they didn't know exactly how old they were. They had field estimates putting the age at around 260 million years.
But that changed?
Through uranium-lead zircon dating, a technique that measures the decay of uranium in crystal structures, scientists later refined the age to approximately 280 million years. This was more precise than the initial estimates. It puts the forests even more firmly in the late Permian period, right at the boundary of great change.
So the age itself was a discovery?
Yes. And here's another remarkable detail. In the aftermath of these Antarctic discoveries, the research team looked for the Permian-Triassic boundary layer, the actual geological line that marks the extinction event. For years, that boundary had been difficult to locate in Antarctic rocks. The Goldbranson team's findings helped other researchers identify exactly where it was.
So this discovery sparked more discoveries.
It did. Subsequent expeditions to the same region have found additional fossils, additional evidence. The McIntyre Promontory has become a focal point for Permian extinction research. And here's something that might seem small, but is actually profound. In the rocks associated with the extinction boundary, scientists have found a fungal spike, an unusual abundance of fungal spores and mycelia.
What does a fungal spike mean?
It suggests that at the moment of extinction, the world was literally decomposing. Think about it. When the plants die, when the animals that depend on them die, what's left? Rotting biomass, decaying organic material. And that's the perfect environment for fungi. Fungi are the decomposers. They feed on death. So this fungal spike is almost a signature of extinction. It's evidence that the living world was dying and the fungal decomposers were having a feast.
That's rather dark.
It is. It tells us that the extinction wasn't sudden, like an asteroid impact. It was prolonged. It was a world slowly choking on its own decomposition. And these Antarctic fossils, with their preserved proteins, their fungal associations, their geochemical signatures, tell us that story in unprecedented detail.
So these trees are they're like witnesses to the greatest disaster in Earth's history.
Yes, they're frozen witnesses. They've preserved their testimony in wood and ash for 280 million years. And finally, we have the technology and knowledge to read their testimony, to understand what they're telling us. And what they're telling us is that the Earth is fragile, that rapid environmental change can be catastrophic, that adaptation has limits.
I was reading something in the library about how different cultures understand ancient history. Some cultures have stories about ages of ice, ages of fire. Do you think discoveries like this change how we understand ourselves?
That's a profound question, Celine. On one level, yes, discovering that Antarctica was green, that it was verdant with life, that changes how we see the planet. We realize that what we assume to be permanent, ice sheets, frozen wastelands, is actually temporary. It's an accident of recent geology.
Does this relate to Japanese thinking about nature? I remember learning that Japanese philosophy sees nature as constantly changing, nothing permanent.
Exactly, Ethan. The Buddhist concept of impermanence, the Shinto understanding of nature as dynamic and alive, these philosophical traditions have long understood what these fossils prove scientifically. The world is always changing. What seems stable is only a moment in deep time. The Permian forests seemed eternal to the organisms living in them. They'd existed for millions of years, but from the perspective of geological time, they were fleeting.
And in Europe, we have stories of ice ages, of entire continents being buried under glaciers. Discovering that Antarctica was once green
inverts that narrative. It suggests that the ice ages were the anomaly and temperate climates were more normal.
Yes. The Earth's climate system swings between states. Sometimes it favors glaciation, sometimes it favors warmth. But what we're learning from the Permian is that the transition between these states can be destabilizing. It's the change itself that's dangerous, not necessarily the endpoints.
So basically, we should be worried because we're changing things faster than evolution can handle.
That's a fair way to put it, Ethan. Evolution works on timescales of generations, of thousands or millions of years. We're changing the atmosphere in decades. We're changing the ocean chemistry in decades. Most organisms can't adapt that quickly. They can't migrate fast enough. They can't evolve new strategies fast enough. And that's where extinction happens.
These Antarctic trees couldn't pick up and move somewhere cooler. They were stuck.
Exactly. And many modern organisms are equally stuck. They're trapped in habitats that are changing too fast. But unlike the Glossopteris trees, we as humans have a choice. We have technology, we have knowledge, we have the ability to change course. And that's what makes studying these fossils so important.
Let me bring this all together. We've traveled from the frozen continent of Antarctica to the green Gondwana of 280 million years ago. We've met Erik Gulbrandsen, the paleoecologist whose vision led to one of the most important paleobotanical discoveries of the 21st century.
We've learned that ancient Antarctic forests were not hostile wastelands, but thriving, complex ecosystems where trees had adapted to survive months of darkness and months of constant daylight.
And we've learned that these forests were part of something larger, the Permian extinction event, the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history, where the climate changed too fast for life to adapt.
But there's one name I want us all to remember. One person whose dedication and scientific rigor made this discovery possible. Remember Erik Gulbrandsen. Remember the paleoecologist who spent months in the Antarctic winter looking for fossils that others thought were impossible to find. Remember the scientist who had the vision to understand what these trees could tell us about the ancient world and our modern crisis.
Yes, remember Erik Gulbrandsen and everyone who works to understand our planet's history.
Remember the fossil forest of Antarctica. Remember that life is adaptable but also fragile. Remember that climate change isn't new to Earth, but our responsibility to understand it is.
You know, something that strikes me about this story, Robert Falcon Scott wrote in his journal about fossils he found. He said, "These fossils are the most interesting discovery we have made. They show that this land has not always been a frozen wilderness."
And now, 100 years later, we know how true that was. We know in cellular detail.
The green Antarctica of the Permian is gone. It's been buried beneath 280 million years of geological change. It's been frozen beneath miles of ice, but it's not really gone. It lives on in these fossilized fragments. It lives on in our understanding of what the Earth can become. It lives on as a warning and as a wonder.
It's kind of beautiful, actually, that something so ancient can still teach us something important.
It is beautiful, Nils. That's what history is. It's the dialogue between the past and the present. It's the voices of ancient forests speaking to us across millions of years, telling us who they were, how they lived, and ultimately how they died. And we have the privilege of listening.
And sharing their stories.
Until our next journey through time, keep history alive. So what's next week, Nils? Where are we heading?
We're staying on the frozen continent of Antarctica, but we're jumping forward in time. 300 million years have passed. The Permian is over. The Triassic has come and gone. We're now in the Jurassic period.
Dinosaurs?
Dinosaurs, yes. But more than that, we're looking at the moment when a massive meteor or asteroid impacts Antarctica, leaving a scar that scientists are only now discovering beneath the ice sheet.
Another extinction event?
Not exactly, but an impact that may have shaped the entire history of dinosaurs on this continent. Join us next week for Asteroid over Antarctica, the Wilkes Impact and Lost Dinosaurs.
Don't miss it.